Chapter 23 Freedom from Insecurity. In a world of constant change and unfamiliar elements, it's natural to look for security, something reliable and protective. The three forms of security often sought are financial, the assurance that one will never be poor; intellectual, the assurance that one is right in his beliefs; and emotional, the assurance that one will always be loved. It's natural to want these things, and it's realistic to think that they are possible. Unfortunately, though, most people look for security where it can't be found, and in the process, they become even more insecure. They hope that someone outside themselves can guarantee security and end their need to be concerned about it. But all they do is make themselves more vulnerable, and hence more insecure, by becoming dependent upon someone else. Security comes from your ability to deal with the world, not from a guarantee by someone else. When you know you're capable of handling whatever comes, you have the only security the world has to offer. And your ability to deal with the world depends upon three assets: self-reliance, vigilance, and honesty with yourself. To be self-reliant is to recognize that no one else is as concerned about your future as you are, and that no one knows as much about you as you do. You can delegate decisions to others, but a secure individual recognizes that he is taking a risk when he does so. He knows that the responsibility for anything concerning his life remains with himself, and he accepts that responsibility. To be vigilant is to recognize that there will be constant change in the world. There are always unknown factors that can affect your plans. So, the secure individual is always mentally prepared for changes and surprises. He doesn't necessarily have a plan in mind to handle those changes and surprises, but he's aware that they can happen and is prepared to deal with them as they arise. To be honest with yourself means to acknowledge mistakes as they become known. If you can accept your mistakes, you can correct them, pay for them, learn from them, and see that they don't interfere with your security. The individual who can't acknowledge his mistakes will remain vulnerable and be doomed to repeat them. If you have these assets, you have no reason to be afraid. You'll know you can have love and financial security, and you won't need anyone to tell you that you are right. Let's look at each of the three forms of security to see how these principles work. Financial security. All financial dealings depend upon the reaction of the general market. Whether your assets are in cash, investments, skills, or property, the worth of them will be dependent upon market acceptance. As tastes and values change, the general market changes. Stocks go up and down. Currencies rise and fall. Property changes in value. Many people thought they had found security in the 1920s by putting their money in the stock market, or by having it handled by a bank. They felt that their interests were being protected by people more capable than themselves. They were proven wrong in 1929, and they paid for their willingness to rely upon others. Naturally, it's helpful to utilize the information provided by people who specialize in various fields, and to use the services they offer. But it's a mistake to think that those people know everything necessary, or that they will always act in your best interests. In the same way, it is foolish to believe the government can protect or guarantee your future. Governments are subject to the same laws of economics as anyone else. The only security they offer is the promise to take care of you with other people's money. But what if those other people don't produce enough to take care of everyone who is relying upon the government? Many people have faith that the government can somehow overrule the laws of economics, or that the government can use more resources than actually exist. So they trust the claims that their bank deposits are insured, that medical care will always be available to them, that Social Security will eliminate the need to provide for their futures. But the government has no power to transform stones into bread. And if there's another Great Depression, as I think there will be, this will become all too evident. This doesn't mean you had to spend all your time watching your money. It means only that you must allow for many different possibilities. Diversification, periodic monitoring, and the willingness to acknowledge mistakes are the necessary ingredients of a secure future. For example, Swiss banks in general are more realistic and more conservative, and so are safer depositories for savings than American banks. But the alert individual will increase the odds for safety by doing 2 or more Swiss banks, so as not to be vulnerable to any one of them. Security doesn't require absolute knowledge of the future. It is simply the recognition that changes will take place and the knowledge that you're willing to deal with whatever happens. You will have that attitude if you are willing to rely upon yourself, recognize the state of constant change, and be willing to acknowledge any mistakes you make along the way. Financial insecurity is inherent in any situation where you are relying upon someone outside of your control. Then you're vulnerable. He has to be right, and you will naturally worry that things may not work out as you want them to. Income. The same principles apply to your ability to require income in the future. No one can take the gamble out of life for you, no matter how much he may promise to do so. But when you recognize that you have the power to deal with anything that lies ahead, an uncertain future can be a source of adventure rather than a fearful liability. I haven't the faintest idea what I'll be doing 5 years from now. I may be writing books. I may be doing something else that I can't even conceive of now. I don't know where I'll be living. I know only one thing, that life will continue to be as exciting and as full of happy surprises as it is now. My life is an adventure because I'm not vulnerable to someone else's mistakes. I'm not depending upon someone to guarantee my income, someone who could fail. If I fail, it will be a simple matter to pay for my mistakes and move right on to better things. If I were to stake my future on someone else's ability, I'd be constantly afraid that he might not do the right things. Afraid that he might make a bad mistake, but wouldn't have the honesty to acknowledge and correct it. If a factory closes, most of the people who worked there will sulk over their misfortune. They had depended upon the continuation of that one source of income. They were vulnerable because they couldn't conceive of any other possibilities. Meanwhile, a free person will move on to something better. He may have no new alternatives in mind at the time of the closing, but he knows that other alternatives exist, and that he can always find a way of being valuable to someone in exchange for money. He's prepared for such a possibility because he never believes that any situation has to be permanent. He's ready for change whenever it might happen. No one can guarantee a steady paycheck for you. Anyone who promises to do so is simply being unrealistic. Your income will always depend upon the changing values of the general market. You can't expect to receive money unless you're providing a service to someone who is willing to pay for it. That applies whether you perform services or make investments. If you realize that there will always be people willing to pay to have things done, and if you're willing to find out what they're willing to pay for, you have nothing to be afraid of. You will know that you can always strike a bargain with someone to do something, even if you're flat on your back. You may decide to have the managers of a company provide a market for your services, but don't assume it must be permanent. For if you do, you will be insecure. They can be wrong. They can fail. They can lose interest in their work. But you will never lose interest in yourself or your own future. So why not depend upon you? Intellectual security. For the past 22 chapters, I have been saying that you are sovereign. You're the absolute final judge of the worth of information you receive. You are the one who decides every one of your actions. You are the person who determines what is right and wrong for you. That is the simple reality of it. But many people don't want that responsibility, even though they can't possibly discard it. And so, they hope to be handed a ready-made philosophy of life. Such a person wants someone else to guarantee that he is right, no matter what happens. You are responsible because you will experience the consequences of your own acts, and those consequences are the final judge of whether you have been right or wrong. They provide a verdict from which there is no appeal. The insecure individual hopes somehow to bypass that verdict. He looks for a way to believe he's right, no matter what consequences he experiences. He looks for a source of truth that he can believe in. When he finds it, he accepts it totally. He feels that this gives him the security to know that he is right, and he prefers that kind of security to the need to rely upon his own ability. The philosophy he finds usually contains 3 basic ingredients. They are moral rightness, a leader, and an enemy. These ingredients arm him with an assurance that allows him to disregard the test of consequences. The sense of moral rightness permits him to believe that he is right no matter what the consequences he receives in life. He settles for whatever happiness he gains from knowing he's adhered strictly to the code. He knows he was right in what he did, righter than his successful, wealthy, peaceful, joyous neighbor. Such a philosophy will usually have a leader to give the individual the confidence that he doesn't have in himself. If questions or doubts arise, the leader can set them to rest. The insecure individual may feel, I can't tell what is right, but he says it's right, so he must know. It always seems necessary, too, for the philosophy to have an enemy. That provides a ready-made explanation for any bad consequences that may occur. Since the philosophy is usually expressed in terms of moral truths, the battle with the enemy becomes a moral one. We, the good guys, are moral, and they, the enemy, are immoral. The moralistic overtones create an evangelical fervor. The enemy isn't pictured as a group of misguided individuals who don't understand things as well as we do. Instead, they know what they are doing and know that it's wrong. They are acting deliberately. They are evil. This eliminates the need for the moralist to be tolerant or understanding of anyone whose interests conflict with his. Instead, he can be aggressive, violent, nasty, vitriolic, outraged, because he's dealing with someone who is immoral, and thus not deserving of benevolence. It's an ideal way to relieve the pent-up frustrations that come from having to bear the bad consequences that might come from living by the philosophy. So, the insecure individual looks outside himself for intellectual security. He hopes to find a philosophy that will guarantee him moral rightness, a leader to compensate for his lack of confidence, and an enemy to justify whatever goes wrong. Unfortunately, he lives in a fool's paradise. he still has to deal with the world and with the consequences of his own actions. Meanwhile, the individual who recognizes his own sovereignty considers the consequences of his actions to be the only standard of right and wrong. He knows that he is capable of seeing those consequences and reacting to them as necessary. He can change any course of action that doesn't work. He can handle change and surprises as they occur. He can deal with whatever comes. He would feel insecure only if he had to act in accordance with someone else's judgment. He would be genuinely afraid if someone else's decisions were determining his future. He knows that the future is uncertain, but he's willing to be vigilant, to check the results of his actions, and he's willing to be honest, to acknowledge any mistakes and correct them immediately. He has found the only kind of intellectual security that makes sense: reliance upon his own sovereignty. Emotional security. The desire to be loved, to be understood and appreciated is universal. Unfortunately, many people don't feel they are worthy of such benefits, and so they hope to have them guaranteed without having to earn them. They seek perpetual love and understanding by getting married, by joining groups, or by having children. If you rely upon yourself, you know that you can find the kind of people who will appreciate you. If you rely upon marriage, family, or groups, you know intuitively that you are vulnerable. You can be deserted despite the guarantees. And you know that the appreciation isn't for what you are, but instead for your role in the family or the group. You may find someone to marry, but that doesn't mean he will always love you or that he will understand and appreciate you. You can join groups, but don't be surprised if you find a lot of other lonely people acting as if they are having a good time. Only if you know that you have something to offer can you be sure that you will be appreciated or loved. Only then can you hope to find someone who will appreciate what you are. You have to earn anything you want in life, and emotional security is no exception. You earn it by living up to the standards that have meaning to you, finding other people who value those standards, and continuing to live up to those standards. There is no final resting place, short of death, where you can stop having to earn what you want. If you are loved now, you will continue to be loved only if you continue to satisfy the values of the person who loves you. That fact should bother someone only if he doesn't feel that he is genuinely worthy. Chances are that he's tried to live with an identity that isn't his own, and he's constantly afraid that he won't live up to it, afraid that he'll be found out and deserted. Meanwhile, the individual who accepts his own identity knows that he is something real, something honest, something worthy. He doesn't expect everyone to appreciate that, but he knows someone will. He's willing to expend the effort to find that someone and others who are similar, because he knows the rewards are worth it. He recognizes that values constantly change. When a friendship is no longer in the best interests of both parties, he accepts the ending of it. When a love affair ends, he doesn't try to perpetuate it by appeals to loyalty, dependence, or the preservation of a marriage. Because he is self-reliant and honest with himself, he's constantly growing, and so every relationship he has is more fruitful than the ones that preceded it. He has no fear of the future because he knows the future can only mean better things for him. Emotional security is entirely within your power to achieve when you recognize and depend upon your own sovereignty. You will know that you are capable of finding and enjoying valuable relationships, no matter how those you know may now change. The insecure person hangs on desperately to whatever exists in the present. The secure person accepts and enjoys whatever he has in the present, but as change occurs, he feels no fear of the future. He knows that changes are only preludes to better things. Security. Insecurity comes from vulnerability. The insecure person relies upon protectors, institutions, and people who will guarantee results for him, because he knows intuitively that his interests can't possibly be the paramount interest in someone else's life. He's vulnerable and he knows it. He depends upon his rights to protect him. He hopes for safety and durability from his ability to make others understand him. He clings to situations that are no longer right for him, and the constant frustrations of these situations only heighten his insecurity. He has good reason to be afraid of the world. But security is always possible: financial, intellectual, and emotional. However, it can come only from the willingness to handle whatever comes and the knowledge that you can do so. The knowledge and willingness aren't hard to come by when you form the habit of thinking in terms of the areas that you control. When you realize how much you can do, that doesn't depend upon the agreement of others. You know there's nothing you can't handle. When situations are wrong for you, you can find better situations. You don't have to be frustrated by trying to make those around you treat you better. If you are willing to depend upon the direct alternatives available to you, if you're willing to be alert to changes as they develop, if you're willing to be honest with yourself and with others, you have nothing to be insecure about, because there's nothing you can't handle. If you earn whatever you want, you know that it's yours. Then life is an adventure. The uncertainty of the future is a challenge, not a source of dread.